Welcome to our review and reading of the Declaration of Independence. So, this is the National Archives webpage for it, by the way. It's the one I recommended that you use. Okay. And before I dig in and start with the actual text, what I want to do is just show you a little bit, and this will help when you're trying to take some notes and understand things a little, is that the Declaration is actually split into 4 parts. So we've got this first part, and that's going to talk about the relationship between the government and people, and what is that ideal relationship supposed to be like. Okay. The second part is this list of complaints, and we're going to do a couple of things with this list of complaints, but for right now, I just want you to know that it's a list of complaints. The third part is what have we being the Americans, done to try and solve this problem. Okay. And then we end by saying, so we got to break up. The last section is just this section down here. That's the signatories, right? These are the men, and they are all men, who signed the Declaration of Independence and in a very literal way put their own lives on the line, right? The theory being they were going to hang either all together or not at all. So those are the parts of the Declaration of Independence. And the reason why I mention that is twofold. One, I think it's helpful sometimes to understand the internal structure of something when you're trying to understand it. But two is that the quiz questions to go with this video are broken down that way. Okay? So, that way you know there's one question per section. You kind of know what you're looking out for. All right. With that being said, let's go ahead and begin. In Congress, July 4th, 1776. The unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America, when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to separation. All right, so as we're doing this, I'll stop and I'll explain it as well. One of the things I want to draw your attention to is right here. That's not a typo. Okay? It's not a typo that the word united isn't capitalized. It's intentional. Okay? Because it's united in that traditional sense, as in brought together and joined. So it's not, in this case, the name of the country. We don't call ourselves that till later. But it's this, the 13 united colonies. That's really what that's saying. Okay? So when in the course of human events, the course of history, really, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them to another, it becomes needed that one group of people, one nation, should break free from the control of another, right? And to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station. So here they're saying we're going to become our own country, okay, to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them. So we're going to become our own country. We're going to be equal to everybody else, right? And we're entitled to that. A decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. And this is how you know, anytime you read a document, especially a primary document, you want to think about who is the audience. Okay, so Thomas Jefferson wrote the text, and then Ben Franklin and John Adams helped edit it and provided some feedback, but Jefferson's the primary author. Okay. Who's he writing to? Okay. Is he writing to people in the US at the time in the 1770s? Is he writing to the people of England in the 1770s? Is he writing to you or to me? And the short answer is yes. He's doing all of those things. Okay? He's writing for history, and he's recognizing that. He's recognizing that because what they're doing is not something that had ever been done before. Okay? Not something that had ever been done before. And so he recognizes in that sentence that what he's doing is he's writing not just to the king, though that's who it's formally addressed, not just to the people of England, though it is for them to read as well, right? It's basically an open letter. Same thing with the people of the colonies, but he's also writing to you and to me to explain what's going on. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Okay, so self-evident, everybody knows. We really wouldn't even need to state these, right? They're just, everybody knows it. And this is arguably the most famous sentence in the Declaration, right? That all men are created equal. And men in this case, he was being literal. Men, right? It's the 1770s. Women are not equal. They're not thought of as equal. Okay. He does not say all white men. And this is where later on, right, you get to, say, the civil rights movement, you get to the aftermath of the Civil War, people talk about living up to the promise of America, right? This all men, that's part of that promise, that we're striving to create the better union, right? So he says all men, and part of that better union, by the way, is to make that men a universal term to describe all people. But that's not how he meant it at the time. Okay. That they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And he actually steals this idea, right? Unalienable rights, life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, from a guy named John Locke. Thomas Jefferson was nothing if not well read. John Locke was an English political philosopher, and what he actually says in his second treatise on government is that it's life, liberty, and property. So Jefferson takes it, he borrows it, he tweaks it to suit the zeitgeist at the time, right? But that idea of life, liberty, and property is going to come back in the Constitution. We're going to see that embodied a little bit later. Okay. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. All right, so we've got these rights that have been given to us, that are just ours, right, that we cannot give away, that cannot be taken away. That's what unalienable rights means. Okay. And in order to secure them, we put together governments among men. Okay, so we have governments to help us protect our rights. And these governments derive their powers, they get their powers from the consent of the governed. So in other words, because you and I say that the governments can have those powers. Okay, that's what consent of the governed means. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it. Okay, so if the government isn't doing what it's supposed to, if it's becoming destructive toward that end of protecting our unalienable rights, then people have the right to get rid of it, right? To alter it. Alter means to change, or to abolish. Abolish means to get rid of, right? and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Okay. So again, we've got certain rights that can't be taken away, right? That's what unalienable means. They can't be taken away. We have governments to secure those rights, right? To prevent us from trying to take them away from each other. And if the government isn't doing that, then we have the right to get rid of the government and put in its place, and now I'm at the newest part, right? Put in its place the one which we, the people, right, think will do the best job to keep us safe and happy. Okay. Prudence, and here I am, indeed, will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes. Prudence is another way of saying care, right? Caution. So caution indeed will dictate that when you've had a government for a long time, you shouldn't get rid of it just because you are having a bad day, right? Just for no reason at all. Okay. And accordingly, all experience hath shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer, while evils are sufferable, than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. Okay. And when you look at history, people don't tend to get rid of their governments. Okay. Even if the governments are evil, so long as the evils are sufferable, right? As long as you can live with it, people don't tend to get rid of their governments. Okay. This gets back to that idea of what I was saying before about this being really the first time that something like this had happened. Okay. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, so a long train just means a lot of things have happened. Abuses, that word you probably know, right? Usurpations means to take things away. So, when we've been treated poorly and had things taken away that ought not to be, that's really what the first part of that sentence says. Pursuing invariably the same object evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism. Okay, so we've been abused, we've had things taken away in order to put us under an all-controlling reign that we don't want. Okay. Invariably the same object evinces a design. That's a plan. Okay. Shows us that there's a plan to reduce them under despotism. So if you think back early in American history, right, as the colonists are first coming over, and American here, I'm talking about the US, not the continent, right, as the colonists are coming over, England largely ignores them. Okay. Basically, the colonists can do what the colonists will do. There's some limitations, but by and large, okay. We go to war with the French, and by we, I mean really the English, because at this point, there's no America, it's just the British Empire. British Empire goes to war with the French. It's very, very expensive. England doesn't have the money, and the British people are complaining about being taxed to defend these colonists all the way across the ocean, and the colonists aren't really being taxed at all, right? Not much, if anything. There's, again, very little control. So the king and parliament have been asserting more and more control starting in about the 1750s. It's about 25 years before this. Okay, so this is what he's referring to. This is what he's referring to. Okay, he says they're bringing us under more and more control, and he's arguing that this is a form of despotism. All right, back here. All right. It is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security, right? So you've been trying to control us wickedly far over the top. That's what despotism is, right? It is their right, their in this case meaning the colonists, right? It is their duty to throw off such a government. We've got a duty to break away from you, right? And to do something different, provide new guards for their future security. Such has been the patient sufferance of these colonies, and such is now the necessity which constrains them to alter their former systems of government. Okay. So we've been patient, we've been suffering, okay, but now it's necessary for us to try and do something different, to try and change the way it used to be. The history of the present King of Great Britain, that is to say George III, is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world. All right, so I'm going to pause there because we're at the end of that first part that I was talking about. And I've been explaining a little bit as we go. But the quiz question talks about the ideal relationship. All right, so the perfect relationship between people and their governments is that governments protect their rights, right? Their right to life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. Okay? That's the perfect relationship, that's what they do. England, Jefferson's arguing here, hasn't been doing that. And it hasn't been doing that for at least as long as George III has been on the throne. Okay? And that what they've been doing, indeed, is gradually adding controls. And they're doing so in a way that is no longer sufferable, that the colonists can no longer live with. And as a result, the colonists are going to break away. Okay? And then Jefferson says, to prove this, let these facts be submitted to a candid world. This is how you know he's speaking not just to George III or even just to Parliament. Okay? He's speaking to everybody. So he's speaking to everybody at the time, right? He's speaking to the King of France, he's speaking to the Belgians, he's speaking to the Germans, he's speaking to the Russians, he's speaking to you and to me. Okay. All right. Second part is a list of complaints. That's really what it is. Ultimately, I'm going to have you look for themes and put these into categories. Okay. So as we're reading, it might do you good to think about what are the different categories. He has refused his assent to laws, the most wholesome and necessary for the public good. Okay. Every time they say he, that's George III, the king. Okay. Because they're just going to say he all the way through. So assent means like permission, right? He's not allowing laws that we think we need for our public good, for everybody's good. Okay. He has forbidden his governors to pass laws of immediate and pressing importance, unless suspended in their operation till his assent should be obtained. And when so suspended, he is utterly neglected to attend to them. It's worth remembering in the 1770s, there is no internet, there is no telephone, there are no computers. So George III, what he said is the governors, which are typically appointed by George, right? He says the governors cannot pass the laws that they need to pass unless they say, okay, we're going to put this law in place, but we got to wait to get permission, right? Unless suspended in their operation. That's the waiting to get permission. Okay. And when so suspended, he is utterly neglected to attend to them. So not only are we having to wait the roughly 3 months potentially round trip for these to get permission to have these laws, George III is ignoring them once the petition with the laws get there. Okay. He has refused to pass other laws for the accommodation of large districts of people, unless those people would represent the right of representation in the legislature, a right inestimable to them and formidable to tyrants only. Right? So George III has refused to pass laws for the accommodation, right, to meet the needs of large districts of people. Districts are just areas, okay? Unless those people would relinquish the right to representation in the legislature, representation in Parliament. Parliament is the legislature at that point. It still is in Britain, okay? A right inestimable to them and formidable to tyrants only. Of inestimable means invaluable, right? That we can name no value for that right. And for them to have that right is a problem only for tyrants, right? For people who want to have too much control. He has called together legislative bodies at places unusual, uncomfortable, and distant from the depository of their public records for the sole purpose of fatiguing them into compliance with his measures. All right, so legislative bodies, by the way, they make laws. That's what they do. Okay. So George III has called together legislative bodies, groups of men, to make laws at places unusual, uncomfortable, and distant from the depository of their public records. So, in other words, he's asking them to come over to England to make the laws, right? Public records are anything from the current laws passed to criminal records to business licenses, things like that, okay? Any just kind of public information for the sole purpose of fatiguing them into compliance with his measures. In other words, of making them so tired that they just say, yeah, dude, whatever, man, I don't care. I just don't care anymore, right? He has dissolved representative houses repeatedly for opposing with manly firmness his invasions on the rights of people. The colonists, each colony had its own legislature. Okay? And George III had the right to dissolve those, and he did. Okay? Oftentimes for, as Jefferson says, opposing with manly firmness, meaning saying no, right? So George III, according to Jefferson, is invading on the rights of the people. The legislatures are saying, not gonna do it. We're not gonna let you do that. And he says, all right, you're done, go home. Right? We're dissolved. Go away. He has refused for a long time after such dissolutions to cause others to be elected, whereby the legislative powers, incapable of annihilation, have returned to the people at large for their exercise, the state remaining in the meantime exposed to all the dangers of invasion from without and convulsions within. So in other words, George III, when he's collapsing these parliaments, right, these representative houses, he's not dissolving them and then the next day saying, let's have elections. He's dissolving them and waiting a long time. Whatever a long time might be. It'll be different for different times and places. Okay? But he's waiting a long time. And because he's waiting a long time, the legislative powers, the ability to make the laws and rules that are needed, right? Which he cannot get rid of, right? That's what incapable of annihilation means. They cannot be gotten rid of, right? Have returned to the people at large for their exercise. The community, right? That's really what that says. The state remaining in the meantime exposed to all the dangers of invasion from without and convulsions within. In other words, we can't guard ourselves because we can't make the law, we can't say pass a law that says all men 18 to 25 are going to serve a stint in the military to help defend us from Indian invaders, is I'm sure what Jefferson had in mind at the time, right? But also, if, say, there's a rebellion from within, let's just say the whiskey makers decide they don't want to pay the tax that they're supposed to pay, right? And so they just start rebelling. Well, now we can't call up those 18 to 25-year-olds and say, you got to fight the whiskey makers, okay? So we can't defend ourselves against invaders from without, but we also can't police ourselves from problems within. He has obstructed the administration of justice, and here I am, by, oh wait, I lied, I skipped one. Let me go back. He has endeavored to prevent the population of these states, for that purpose obstructing the laws for the naturalization of foreigners, refusing to pass others to encourage their migrations hither, and raising the conditions of new appropriations of lands. All right. He has endeavored to prevent the population of these states. He's not letting people move over. Okay? When they say prevent the population, that's what they're talking about. We're not allowing more people to come. For that purpose, obstructing the laws of the naturalization of foreigners, okay? The ability of people to become British citizens in this case. Okay? Refusing to pass others to encourage their migrations hither. He's not passing laws encouraging people to come. He's, again, kind of sitting on his hands, right? And raising the conditions for new appropriations of lands. He's making it much harder for us to go out and take new lands. And this is a reference to a law that basically kind of puts some edges around how far west the colonists could go, the Northwest Ordinance. That's the title I'm looking for. Okay. So Jefferson saying, you know, not only are you not encouraging people to come, but you're preventing us from conquering new lands. He has obstructed the administration of justice by refusing his assent to laws for establishing judiciary powers. Right? Administration of justice, that really is literally like the courts. Okay? So he's saying he's not allowing us to have any kind of a court system, George III, because he's refusing his permission to laws for establishing those courts. Okay. He has made judges dependent on his will alone for the tenure of their offices and the amount and payment of their salaries. Okay, so now we're into the courts. George III has made judges dependent on his will alone, right? What the king wants or thinks, for the tenure of their offices, for the ability to remain a judge. That's what tenure means, the ability to remain at doing something. And the amount and payment of their salaries. In other words, George III, in theory alone, right, decides the amount and the payment of judges' salaries. So if judge makes a decision George doesn't like, George just says, you're fired and we're not paying you for the last couple of weeks. Take that, right? That's kind of what they're saying. Jefferson's saying there, okay? He has erected a multitude of new offices and sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people and eat out their substance. Bureaucracy, right? He's creating a bunch of bureaucracy and bureaucrats, and this is a reference again. Remember, I was talking about the aftermath of the French and Indian War and increasing control being put on the colonies. So we've got all these new people coming over to exercise that control, to implement these new taxes, right? And things like that. So he's created these offices, and he's sending people over to fill them, right? In the process, those people are then harassing our people. He's drawing a line here between us as the Americans and the British over in the UK, right? And eat out their substance. What he's saying here really is we're being forced to support them. So it's not that George III is being forced to support them. We're being forced to support them. He is kept among us in times of peace, standing armies without the consent of our legislatures. Some of this is to help keep everybody safe, right? In the sense that we've got hostile neighbors in the Spanish down in the south, because the Spanish were still in Florida at this point. No longer the French, well, kind of the French, but not really. Okay, up in Canada. And then we've got Native Americans. So George III is kept among us in times of peace, right? In other words, when there's not an explicit war, standing armies without the consent of our legislatures. Standing armies just literally mean like what we have today. Our U.S. Army is a standing army. They're just there, right? We're not putting them together at the time we need to fight. We've got them ready to go right away. They're just hanging out waiting for the call to arms. Okay, it says without the consent of our legislatures, without our permission. Okay. He is affected to render the military independent of and superior to the civil power. Right? Render just means make. That's really what that means here. Okay. The military independent of and superior to. Superior means above. Civil power. This is the government. Okay. And in this case, it's the local government. So he's putting the military in charge. That's really what they're saying there. Okay. By the way, just as a side note, when we do the Bill of Rights and the Constitution, you're going to see a lot of reaction to these complaints. Okay. He has affected the rendered... Oh, sorry, I was just there. Let me try the next one. He is combined with others to subject us to a jurisdiction foreign to our Constitution and unacknowledged by our laws, giving his assent to their acts of pretended legislation. So he's combined with others to subject us to a jurisdiction, right? Basically to be under the rule of, right? Foreign to our Constitution. Foreign means not what we're used to in this case. Okay. Constitution, that's not again not a typo. It's a lowercase c intentionally. And Constitution in this sense means our bodies and what we're used to. And bodies in the metaphorical sense. Okay. So he's combined with others to subject us to a rule foreign to what we're used to. Right, to what our body politic is used to, and unacknowledged by our laws. In other words, we haven't said yes, right? It's not, we can't find any reference to this in our laws. Giving his assent to their acts of pretended legislation. Parliament, that's really what this is getting to. Okay. For quartering large bodies of armed troops among us. It's the Quartering Act, right? In Boston in the aftermath of the Boston Tea Party. Remember, George III sent over a whole bunch of troops and they lived throughout the city of Boston, oftentimes in the houses of known revolutionaries as a way of keeping an eye on people. For protecting them by a mock trial from punishment for any murders which they should commit on the inhabitants of these states. Right? Mock means fake. Okay, so he's protecting the armed troops from, by use of a fake trial, from punishment. So technically they're going to trial, but the verdict's already preordained. We know what it's going to be, right? They're not going to get punished. Okay, even if they murder someone. Okay. For cutting off our trade with all parts of the world. This is literally, they jam up Boston Harbor in the aftermath of the Tea Party, and they refuse to allow boats in or out. Okay. Until Boston has made up the cost of the tea. for imposing taxes on us without our consent. Again, back to those intolerable acts, right? For depriving us, in many cases, of the benefits of trial by jury, not actually a right in the British Constitution, okay? But it becomes something very important in our system. Jury, by the way, just means a group of people from our community of roughly the same background, about people who are familiar with local circumstances. For transporting us beyond seas to be tried for pretended offenses. In other words, George III is making us go over to England to be tried for things. For abolishing the free system of English laws in a neighboring province, and establishing therein an arbitrary government, and enlarging its boundaries so as to render it at once an example and fit instrument for introducing the same absolute rule into these colonies. French Canada. This is about Canada and Quebec, right? So we're abolishing, because the French and the English were fighting over Canada. That's why Quebec still speaks French, even though most of Canada grows up speaking English, right? So we're abolishing that system of laws and establishing in there an arbitrary government, and then gradually enlarging its boundaries, okay? With the idea being we're going to ultimately encompass and include the 13 colonies. For taking away our charters, abolishing our most valuable laws, and altering fundamentally the forms of our governments. Colonies are established by charters. It's like a contract. Really, it sets out what are the rights and responsibilities of people who move over. How are we going to rule things? What's going to be the policy on things like religious tolerance? Things of that nature, right? Okay. Abolishing means, again, to get rid of, okay? So we're taking away and getting rid of the legal systems and altering the forms of government that have sprung up. For suspending our own legislatures and declaring themselves invested with power to legislate for us in all cases whatsoever. So remember, we're talking about Parliament here, what they're doing. So when you say declaring themselves invested. So suspend, we're telling people to go home. We're not allowing them to make the laws. Remember, that's what legislatures do. And saying, instead of you all making your own laws, we're going to make all the laws way over here in England, where we don't know anything about anything, right? He, back on George III, has abdicated government here by declaring us out of his protection and waging war against us. To abdicate means to give up, right? It's a term used, we're talking about giving up the ability to rule over something else mostly, right? So George III has given up on government here and declared us out of his protection and waged war against us. He brought the troops over and started to fight us, dude. What do you want us to do, right? If he's not gonna protect us, we got to protect ourselves. He has plundered our seas, ravaged our coasts, burnt our towns, and destroyed the lives of our people. Fairly self-explanatory, right? George III is going after the boats. That's plundered the seas, ravaged the coasts. Now he's sending people off the boats onto the mainland, and they are doing all kinds of mean and obnoxious things, right? Burnt our towns and destroyed the lives of our people. Pretty self-explanatory. He is, at this time, transporting large armies of foreign mercenaries to complete the works of death, desolation, and tyranny, already begun with circumstances of cruelty and perfidy scarcely paralleled in the most barbarous ages, and totally unworthy the head of a civilized nation. George III is at this time transporting, so he's bringing over large armies of foreign mercenaries. Mercenaries are paid soldiers, right? And in this case, they're coming over from Germany, okay, to complete the works of death, desolation, and tyranny, to finish the job. All right. He's bringing over foreign soldiers, mostly Germans, to finish the job. Already begun with circumstances of cruelty and perfidy. Perfidy is like lying is probably a good parallel, where you are not just lying, but doing so in a way that is particularly bad. So it's not just, you're lying about where you got the candy bar that you took out of your Halloween sack to your mom, but you're, blaming your brother for lighting the cat on fire. Something like that, right? It's particularly bad. Scarcely paralleled in the most barbarous ages and totally unworthy the head of a civilized nation. He's misbehaving, right? Not only is he misbehaving, but he's misbehaving really badly. And he's bringing in his buddies from Germany because George III was German. He inherits the British throne because he happens to be the first eligible person in the line, but royal families were all interconnected. They still are to a large degree related. So that's how you get people that are German, for example, at the head of the British government. Okay. So he's bringing over these foreign mercenaries as buddies to beat us up, right? To finish the job of really beating us into submission. And this is not worthy of him, and it's not worthy of the British people, is what Jefferson's saying there. He has constrained our fellow citizens taken captive on the high seas to bear arms against their country, to become the executioners of their friends and brethren, or to fall themselves by their hands. He has constrained, he has forced our fellow citizens taken captive on the high seas. So in other words, not only is he attacking all the boats that are coming and going, right? That's that ravaging our coasts, right? But he's forcing people to join the Royal Navy. Press ganging is what this is called. Okay, so he's pressing people into service and making them fight against their friends. Brethren means brothers, right? Or to fall themselves by their hands. Okay, so they might be being forced to harm themselves or harm others. He has excited domestic insurrections among us and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers the merciless Indian savages, whose known rule of warfare is as undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. All right. George III has excited domestic insurrections among us. He's causing people to rise up against our government. Remember, we're in Congress, right? We're in the Second Continental Congress, sorry. And George III is causing the loyalists to fight against us, right? And has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers the merciless Indian savages. That's pretty straightforward. He's encouraging Native Americans to come in and attack us, right? Whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. They're killing everybody and burning stuff down. Okay? That's really what he's talking about. So, he ends and wraps it up with this thought, and this is not a complaint, but it's just a closing thought. In every stage of these oppressions, we have petitioned for redress in the most humble terms. Our repeated petitions have been answered only by repeated injury. A prince whose character is thus marked by every act which may define a tyrant is unfit to be the ruler of a free people. Okay, so every time he's done something to us, right, in every stage of these oppressions, every time he's done something to us, we have petitioned for redress in the most humble terms. we've asked nicely for him to stop it. That's really what that means. We petitioned for redress. We wanted him to fix it and to stop it. Our repeated petitions have been answered only by repeated injuries. So not only did he keep doing it, he got worse. Okay? Anybody who does this is not fit to rule. He's not fit to be the ruler of a free people. Okay? So that's the end of that second part, that part with the complaints. The last couple of paragraphs form a third part. And this is the part where we're explaining to everybody all the things that we've tried, right? So when we say we've petitioned for redress, here's the ways we've done it. And to whom we've been addressing it. So I'm right here, okay? Nor have we been wanting in our attentions to our British brethren. So we've been paying attention to our British brothers. We've been talking to them, right? We have warned them from time to time of attempts by their legislature to extend an unwarrantable jurisdiction over us. Their legislature is Parliament. We've warned them, we've told them before that Parliament is trying to extend an unwarrantable, unnecessary, unneeded, unjustifiable jurisdiction over us, control over us. We have reminded them of the circumstance of our emigration and settlement here. Most of the people who went to the colonies because they wanted to escape control of the British government for one reason or another. Okay? So we've reminded them that we went specifically to get away from that control. We didn't want it. We have appealed to their native justice and magnanimity, and we have conjured them by the ties of our common kindred to disavow these usurpations, which would inevitably interrupt our connections and correspondence. Native in this sense means innate, inborn, right? We've appealed to their natural sense of justice and magnanimity. Justice, you know, right? Fairness. Magnanimity is another way of saying generosity. Okay? And we have conjured them by the ties of our common kindred, our relationship to them. We've asked them to disavow these usurpations, to say that they shouldn't be done, right? To disavow, to say, I don't agree with that, right? Usurpations, again, things that are taken away, which would inevitably interrupt our connections and correspondence. So in other words, we've asked the British people to tell Parliament to knock it off. Because if they don't, we're going to have to break away. Or we're going to have to do our own thing. They too have been deaf to the voice of justice and consanguinity. The British people have been deaf. They've not been listening to the voice of justice, fairness, right? And consanguinity is peacefulness, right? We must therefore acquiesce in the necessity which denounces our separation and hold them, as we hold the rest of mankind, enemies in war, in peace, friends. So, you've forced our hand, you've made us do it, right? So now we're going to treat you like we treat everybody else. You're good to us, we'll be good to you. You're mean to us, we'll be mean to you. Okay. So we've appealed, we've asked, we've begged for it to be knocked off. We've gone to the king, we've gone to Parliament, we've gone to the British people. Nothing's working. Okay. We, therefore, the representative of these United States of America, again, united, not capitalized intentionally, it means joined together. States in this case means governments, because each colony is kind of its own separate little thing. In General Congress assembled, so we've come together, appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions. Supreme Judge of the world, it's a way of saying God without saying God. Okay. Do, in the name and by the authority of the good people of these colonies, just remember, government by consent of the governed, so governments act in your name and mine, right? Solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. Okay? We don't love you anymore. We don't want to be part of the British Empire anymore. We're done. And we're telling, not only are we doing this, we're doing it in the most public way possible so everybody recognizes it. Okay? That they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown. Absolved means they don't need to worry about it anymore. Right? Allegiance means the need to obey or take care to care about. Right? And that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved. We didn't say it before, we're saying it again. We're not going to be part of Great Britain anymore. Just the way it is. Sorry. Right? And that as free and independent states, they have full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and do all other acts and things which independent states may of right do. Right? So states in this sense, countries. Okay. So as free and independent countries, we have the power to levy war against you, which we're doing right now, but also in other cases as need be. To conclude peace. Right? So to end the war if we choose to. Contract alliances. Alliances are kind of a fancy schmancy way of saying friendships. Only it's like between countries, so it's a little more, be a little more self-serving than most friendships are. Establish commerce. It's another way of saying trade. Okay, and do all other acts and things which independent states may of right do. We can do everything else any other country can do. And for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. Okay, providence, again, that's just another way of invoking God. Okay, but it's a way of doing it without doing it, because most of these guys are deists, which means they believe in a more hands-off kind of God, right? One who's less directly involved. So we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. We're going to hang together or not at all. Okay? So we're all going to fight for this. We're in this together. And then they sign, this is every member of the Second Continental Congress who was there when they did it. Okay. They're going to sign their names. John Hancock, by the way, here's your fun note. He was a merchant in Boston. Signed his name really big on the document because he wanted to make sure George III could read it. All right. Without further ado, I've taken enough of your time. Go ahead, answer those questions, and I'll see you later.